Hello, everybody, and welcome to History/Political Bite number 346, dated March 26th, 2022. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This political/history bite is entitled, Why Kathleen Kennedy Townsend Lost the 2002 Maryland Gubernatorial Election to Robert Ehrlich Jr. Before I begin, however, I'd like to formally invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Juarez Lee Shelton MA. And in addition to that, please also click on the little notification bell immediately to the right of the subscribe button. In doing so, you will receive notifications when I post new, exciting, and enlightening videos in history, law, theology, political science, and philosophy. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for subscribing. So again, this video is entitled, Why Lieutenant Governor Kathleen Kennedy Townsend Lost to Robert Ehrlich Jr. in the Maryland Gubernatorial Election of 2002. Now, for the record, this was one of my writings from back in 2018 that I am merely putting in video format. So follow me, and hopefully you, if you are a Marylander, you remember the 2002 gubernatorial election. You remember how, much of an upset victory it was for the Republican contender, Bob Ehrlich, and it was most certainly a very interesting campaign, to say the least. So let's dive into it. So an entire generation has passed since the Maryland gubernatorial election of 2002. In that race, Democratic Lieutenant Governor Kathleen Kennedy Townsend was narrowly defeated by Republican Congressman Robert Ehrlich Jr. His upset victory in the Old Line State, where Democrats outnumber Republicans by a substantial margin, came as a shock to many, needless to say, both in Maryland and nationwide. Many, however, were not surprised at all by Townsend's defeat, including her own former boss, Governor Paris Glendening. Though 20 years at the time of this recording have passed since that gubernatorial election, many of its particulars remain fresh in the minds of many, okay? Many political analysts on both sides of the aisle, that being said, have concluded that Bob Ehrlich's victory in that election was overwhelmingly not the result of his own personal appeal in many regards or campaign style, but rather that the Lieutenant Governor, Townsend, ran a very poor campaign against him, okay? That poor campaign contained elements which were entirely within her control, as well as other elements which were beyond her control. So this lecture will expound upon Lieutenant Governor Townsend's campaign unfortunates, and why she lost her bid to become Maryland's 60th governor in 2002. Much of this analysis comes directly from my own memory, but references are provided on technical matters, of course. This writing is not designed to be in any way a personal attack upon the former lieutenant governor, but rather an analysis of her campaign actions from the eyes of myself, this Baltimorean, at the time of that gubernatorial race. In 2002, I was 17 years old and in my last year of high school. And because of those factors, it was arguably the very first gubernatorial race in Maryland that I truly paid attention to and understood and saw what issues were at stake, all right? And therefore, in that race, I paid very close attention to what was being said, and my personal candidate, as a result of the debates and as a result of what was said and what was done, was Mr. Ehrlich. All right. So, getting to the facts, the Townsend campaign was one of many interesting twists and turns, ultimately leading to a dead end on November the 5th, 2002. The campaign was led by Alan Fleischman from start to finish, and he was the likely culprit behind many of her missteps, though of course he denies his role in her defeat. Indeed, Jim Farmer, a fundraiser for Townsend in southern Maryland, commented on Fleischman's ineptitude. All right. He stated, quote, "Alan Fleischman couldn't lead a troop of Boy Scouts out of a telephone booth with a seeing eye dog," end quote. That's pretty straightforward. And he later said, "Please print that." Okay. That's the reason she lost. So, similarly, Townsend herself has never assigned the burden to Fleischman, instead choosing to point fingers at her former boss, Governor Paris Glendening, and his unpopularity as governor during this election. All right. Fleischman, too, has blamed Glendening, which suggests severe irresponsibility on his part. All right. As his choice is to, of course, point the finger rather than acknowledge his own possible missteps. While his role in her defeat is debatable, many of the choices made by the campaign, the Townsend campaign, were clearly wrong. At the beginning of her run for governor, many would have thought that the people of Maryland would happily embrace Robert F. Kennedy's eldest child for the office. But alas, it was not to be. Among her other poor choices, the preeminent one was her selection of retired Admiral Charles Chuck Larson as her running mate. This occurred on June 28, 2002, and ended much speculation over whether or not she would pick a minority for the position. Townsend was likely led to this choice to draw in votes from what was perceived as her weakest links: white males, conservatives, and moderates. Meanwhile, her left-wing base would stick with her by default, or so she thought. Larson was age 65, white, male, and a former Republican who had only switched parties a few weeks earlier to be able to join her ticket. Politically, he was a moderate with no political experience and likely would have supported Democratic objectives. On its face, the strategy seemed very good. But where she went wrong was her failure to discuss the matter with Democratic Party politicians, especially African Americans. Had she done that, they almost certainly, would have gone along with this Machiavellian plot. Instead, she went at it alone with no discussion or endorsement. Because of that, her choice immediately came under fire from prominent Democratic Party officials, especially the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus, for her failure to select an African American for the position. Indeed, Townsend did not consult black leaders in the state at all before making this choice, and her seeming dismissal of their concerns led many to end their support for her campaign over time and endorse her opponent, Ehrlich. Her choice of Larson represents one major reason she did not garner the African American vote and other minority votes in the numbers that she perhaps thought were inevitable. Bad move on her part. Similarly, Larson also turned off many other traditionally Democratic voters because he was a former Republican and simply could not be trusted. For that, many either did not vote at all or voted for Ehrlich in protest. Lastly, Republican voters themselves were not in any way convinced that Larson would be a compromise for them, and they too obviously voted for Ehrlich. In sum, her choice of Larson backfired on all fronts, and because of it, it was likely the poorest move made by her campaign from the outset. By contrast, Ehrlich's virtual same course of action in selecting Michael Steele on July 3rd, 2002, who of course was an African American and chairman of the Maryland Republican Party, ultimately proved to be a strategic success in taking minority votes away from Townsend. Frankly, the selection of Larson for Townsend was a weight around her neck that dogged the campaign for the rest of the election cycle, with no real hope of recovery. Townsend's next ill-advised move, which proved to cost her dearly, was the act of virtually ignoring her base, something that you do not do in politics. In essence, in politics, it is a golden rule, if you will. You do not breach that rule. You do not ignore your base. Your base represents the various individuals who are the core of your party, your truest and most loyal allies. They will typically be with you through thick and thin, no matter how low your campaign goes. They have your back. Because of that loyalty, they must be shown your paramount support and dedication consistently. The absolute last thing you do is ignore your base. With respect to gubernatorial elections in Maryland, 3 jurisdictions are virtually promised to the Democratic candidate. And this was applicable back in 2002 just as much as it is applicable now in 2022. All right. Those jurisdictions are Baltimore City, Montgomery, and Prince George's counties. All right. Now, during her campaign, Townsend seemingly paid very little attention to her base jurisdictions, especially Baltimore City. I mean, I think she forgot we were even on the map of the state of Maryland. Again, perhaps through poor campaign advisement or just really bad decision on her part, she spent very little time campaigning in these areas, which would have been critical for her victory. Duh. Instead, she spent heavy amounts of time campaigning in rural areas, which are Republican in Maryland by default, and thus were very hostile to her campaign. It was pointless, for all intents and purposes, trying to woo the Eastern Shore. All right? I mean, she could have campaigned on the Eastern Shore, Western Maryland, and Southern Maryland until she turned blue in the face. No pun intended, of course. And it would have, all been for naught. All right? These areas in Maryland are committed Republican areas, and they are not voting for any Democratic candidate. Forget it. All right? Maybe outside the major cities, but, the major cities be the only place voting Democratic. The farmlands, mountains, no, forget it. All right? All of those areas traditionally voted Republican. All right? And continue to do so. So that was strike one. All right? Next, the fact that she was a female, was not a woman, was not a problem per se. Recall that, they had voted for Ellen Sauerbrey both in 1994 and 1998 when she was the Republican candidate running against Paris Glendening, all right, who ultimately defeated her in both elections, but not by substantial margins, especially in 1994, I'll add for the record. All right. So the fact that Townsend was a woman was not, in my opinion, a serious issue. It was her and the way her campaign was structured. All right. Because Townsend, however, was a liberal Democratic woman, That is what disqualified her with the rural voter base. And indeed, the failure to do the meaningful campaigning in her base areas led many of these residents to either not bother to vote at all or simply vote for her opponent in protest. Any areas where swing voters were, such as Baltimore and Howard counties, for example, people voted Republican by the thousands. Okay? Perhaps the foolish presumption was that the base areas would vote for her in large numbers by default, so only scant attention to them was required. Obviously, that wasn't the case. In reality, the 2002 election was very much an affirmation of the fact that no matter how much you think you have something in the bag, you never ignore your base. Ever. Okay? These are the people who will either secure your victory or hand you defeat. If your base doesn't come out to support you or votes for the other guy or woman, you are done. Okay? So building upon Townsend's poor attention to her base areas was her taking of the African American vote for granted, which she definitely did, no doubt about it. In 2002, African Americans constituted some 30% of the electorate in Maryland. Nearly all were pledged Democrats, and thus, because of that, it pays heavily to cater to this demographic if you are a Democratic candidate running for office, all right, in Maryland, no matter what office it is, all right? And arguably the same is true now for a Republican running for governor of Maryland. You better make some inroads with the black community or, you can forget that, all right? Townsend failed tremendously in this task. Indeed, it appears that she gave the African American community less than favorable attention when it came to campaigning, and certainly when it came to making policy decisions on her campaign. Okay, this was most clearly evident when she selected Admiral Larson as her running mate. As stated above, this decision was made without any real input from Maryland's black politicians. As a result, there was immediate resentment from many African Americans in the political community, as well from the general voters in her base areas. When they called her out on it, she, like I said, appeared almost dismissive to their concerns. Like, oh, you guys don't have nothing to worry about. I got this, okay? She tried to do some damage control, but for many, this was too little too late. This is not the way you treat a voter population from which your party is almost entirely dependent upon for its electoral success. In fact, it borders on the line of political suicide. Perhaps she thought that regardless of what these politicians thought, black voters would still vote for her anyway because she was a Democrat. And that's what black people do by default, no matter how you treat them. Ha ha. If that's how she really felt, her loss was in good order. It didn't end here, though. Being called out on the matter seemed to cause Townsend to resentfully perform the proverbial cutting off your nose to spite your face. Again, whether it was poor advisement or personal choice remains unknown with absolute certainty, but the backlash from black leaders seemed to direct Townsend to give only token attention to the black communities in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and other important areas where their vote would have been vital for her to win. Okay? Perhaps she thought that this was going to cause black politicians to change their stance and repent. Not so. Such repentance, of course, never occurred. This wasn't a joke in any way, as black voters, especially those in Baltimore City, felt incredibly slighted by Townsend's lack of attention to them and their communities. It's as if she felt that Baltimore City residents, especially black ones, were so automatically going to be in her corner that they were irrelevant and didn't require her attention. Bad mistake. Very, very bad mistake. All right? Black folks might not vote for the Republican, but if they don't like you, they ain't going to vote for anybody. We, in black communities, it's just the way it is, okay? If black folks don't feel that the Democrat is paying them any attention, they're not going to vote for the Republican generally. And what they'll do is just simply not vote at all right? Which essentially, if you're running for office, is just as bad as a vote for the opponent, okay? Anyway, black voters in the other base counties didn't fare much better with respect to visits from Townsend. So all in all, the move proved to be a very costly one in the long run for her, as many African Americans, like I said, either simply did not vote at all or voted for Ehrlich in protest. As, at least he did have a black running mate, so that demonstrated to a lot of black folks that at least Ehrlich is trying to get the black vote, all right? He might be a Republican, and whether or not he might be aimed at our interests, at least he's giving us more attention than you are, sweetheart. That type of thing, all right? So Townsend ultimately received about 75% of the vote in Baltimore City, which had the percentage been even about 15% higher, may have turned the election her way. A lot of people in Baltimore City did not vote in the 2002 gubernatorial race, okay? Alas, though, when voters are ignored, apathy is prominent, and that was certainly the case in 2002. Townsend's seeming ambivalence to black communities across the state would ultimately be one of the elements leading to the next factor playing into her defeat: the defection of Democratic politicians into the hands of Ehrlich. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend inadvertently offended many people who could otherwise have been very strong allies to her. However, making permanent allies didn't seem to be on her agenda, other than what she felt was totally necessary. Her nomination of Admiral Larson to be her running mate, coupled with the fiscal condition of the state at the time, the lack of consultation with black politicians, ignoring party concerns, and scant attention to minority communities throughout the state throughout her campaign, led many Democratic Party politicians to outright defect and endorse Bob Ehrlich. Indeed, several prominent ones from that era, including State Senator Clarence Mitchell IV of Baltimore, Delegate Dana Dimbro of Montgomery County, former Lieutenant Governor Melvin Mickey Steinberg, proudly endorsed Ehrlich. Others included, but were not limited to, former Democratic Senators James Simpson of Charles County, Thomas Yeager of Howard County, and Charles Smelser of Carroll County. Former delegates Leon Albin, Louis DePazzo, Donald Mason, Kenneth Masters, Richard Rind, and Theodore Levin, all of Baltimore County, endorsed Ehrlich. Of course, their motives varied greatly, but all of them were generally on the same page that Townsend was not the right candidate to lead Maryland at this time. This action by so many Democratic politicians, both incumbent and former, was virtually unprecedented in Maryland history. Never before in recent memory had so many familiar names within the party outright refused to support their nominee for governor. Townsend should have realized at this point that her campaign was in a great deal of trouble. But alas, instead of attempting to mend these wounds, her campaign retaliated with harsh rebukes. They stated that most of these politicians left the political stage At the same time, Duran Duran was falling off Billboard charts, and also responded that they were a cluster of failed, forgotten, and disgraced politicians. Wow. Those retorts may have been costly in the long run, as many likely saw them as a desperate plea in disguise to simply not pay these folks any attention because they're all washed up. For all of these individuals, some prominent and some not, to outright endorse the Republican candidate was no less than treasonous to the Townsend campaign, and she did not see the need to reconcile the differences. No matter, their defections did hurt her campaign in the long run, as it likely prompted many Democratic voters to side with Ehrlich. One area in which Lieutenant Governor Townsend found herself that was not her fault was being stuck in Governor Glendenning's shadow. The only thing she could do about this was to distance herself from his unpopularity as much as possible, but arguably she failed to do so. As we remember from those days, Governor Paris Glendenning was leaving office as one of the most unpopular governors in Maryland history. This was due to the state's dismal financial situation, unpopular legislation that he had spearheaded over the past 8 years in office, his recent divorce from his wife and subsequent marriage to a staffer who was more than 30 years his junior, and other actions had made him a very unpopular outgoing governor. Regardless of Townsend's influence on those matters, her status as his lieutenant governor for 2 terms would tie the two together by default. Make no mistake about it, Townsend was quite aware that Paris Glendenning was a very real liability for her campaign. For that reason, she avoided him as much as possible during the course of the campaign itself. That wasn't enough, however, to remove herself from his shadow. Because the lieutenant governor is often viewed as an extension of the governor, they must clearly distinguish themselves when their views or policy initiatives are in contrast to the governor's. Arguably, Townsend did not adequately do this. Indeed, many of the policy initiatives she spoke about and supported were matters already in place or similarly championed by Glendenning over the years. She brought little, if any, new ideas to the table in her gubernatorial campaign, and thus many saw Townsend as tantamount to a 3rd term for Paris Glendenning, a fate which many lieutenant governors have faced when trying to run and replace unpopular, outgoing, termed out incoming governors. Okay? Regardless of party, Democrat or Republican, no one wanted a 3rd term for Glendenning. Okay? And that's what they saw electing Townsend as, a 3rd term for Glendenning. Okay? And that undoubtedly hurt her very badly and, significantly impaired her ability to be elected governor. As stated above, unlike her other missteps, this one was partially outside of her control. All right? You can't control, the unpopularity of your boss. Okay? Next, certainly one of important significance was that the 2001-2002 period was a very good era for Republicans nationwide. This was the only thing working against the lieutenant governor that was entirely beyond her control to manipulate. Bolstered by the events of September 11, 2001 and the ensuing war on terror, President Bush's high popularity during his first term proved to be pivotal fuel for Republicans seeking office across the United States. During this period, they would wind up controlling 24 of the nation's 50 governorships. Similarly, the GOP picked up 8 seats in the House of Representatives and 2 in the U.S. Senate. Indeed, the red wave did flow through the nation in this period and through Democratic strongholds like Maryland and Massachusetts. Republican power and popularity, which obviously trickled into Maryland, only made things more difficult for Townsend's campaign. But this was beyond her grasp, apparently. And despite her best efforts, she may have been on the wrong side of the prevailing tide during this era of Republican popularity and dominance, both at the federal and state levels. Lastly, the lieutenant governor had somewhat of an image problem with many voters. Okay? During the campaign, few would dispute that she was a friendly, considerate, and well-meaning individual. But were those qualities people sought in a governor? Townsend, though having the above qualities, seemed to lack a certain zest or robustness that would energize the Democratic base to get out and vote for her in large numbers. She was a Kennedy, and therefore knew how to engage in a political contest, but quite often she seemed a bit out of her element. A natural campaigner, she was not. And this was seen with her occasional verbal stumbles. Additionally, voters often did not see the energy in her campaign that was quite visible in Ehrlich's. With Ehrlich, it was quite clear that he wanted the job of being governor of Maryland. With Townsend, that clarity wasn't always there. It often appeared to some like she was running out of obligation because she was the lieutenant governor of the state. She was in the race and out campaigning, but arguably her spirit was not always as into the contest as was her opponent. And because of it, many voters did not feel Townsend was the best choice to be governor. Similarly, her selection of Charles Larson did not give voters on either side in this incentive to support her. All right. Conversely, it would cost her, Democratic support substantially, and did absolutely nothing to help her win Republican votes, which is what it was supposed to do. That selection, and other perspectives made many question whether or not she would make wise and responsible choices in running the state. And on November 5th, 2002, many people simply said no. Her Kennedy name was only but so much of a benefit, and it may have hurt her with some who thought she would be just another out-of-touch elite. All right. At the end, it was up to Townsend to put on the image of a future governor, and the people of Maryland concluded that she had not. To conclude, Lieutenant Governor Kathleen Kennedy Townsend ran a campaign which was far from dynamic. Despite having more resources and voters aligned with her party, she still lost the election when it was arguably hers to lose. Arguably it should have gone the other way in the minds of many. Her reasons for defeat, once again, included poor campaign advisement, very poor campaign advisement, the selection of Charles Larson as a running mate, ignoring her base jurisdictions, taking black voters for granted, defection from Democratic Party politicians, failure to distance herself from Paris Glendening, the 2001-2002 season and period being very, very pro-Republican, and of course her own image problem. All of these things, when uniquely blended, had the ability to take down Townsend's candidacy, and they did. So many of the above problems had the ability to be fixed and rebounded from, but she did not see many of the actions as mistakes until it was too late, if she saw them as mistakes at all. By then, the people had already made their choice, and that was Robert Ehrlich Jr. for governor of Maryland in 2002. So I thank you so much for listening to this political/history bite on why Lieutenant Governor Kathleen Kennedy Townsend lost the 2002 Maryland Gubernatorial Election to Robert Ehrlich Jr. If you have any questions or controversies, please leave them down below and I'll be happy to answer them. If you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, I invite you to do so now. And if you like this video, you enjoyed it, gained some insight, perspective, whichever it may be, please drop me a like. Your support means more than you will ever realize. So again, thank you so much for listening. And I conclude with the timeless words of one of my teaching role models, Mr. George Feeney. Believe in yourself, dream, try, do good. And I'll talk to you at the next video. Cheers.